Good. Well, thank you, Tim. Good morning, everybody. And you might wonder what on earth we have to do with training and skills when we're talking about data sharing as the topic for the day. And given the intro to the outputs of CDRC, why is the first session really about training needs? Well, that's partly because the CDRC has several remits. One is around making available in a secure location for new and insightful analysis, new and interesting data sets, and Paul and Alex will talk particularly about some examples of that in a few moments. But the other part of the remit is about training and capacity building, and I wanted to kick off with a bit of that. Why should we worry about training and capacity building? Well, as we have greater aspirations around data acquisition, as we want to share data with others, as we become more ambitious, if you like, in our use of data sources and analyses as new insights become possible, we may not necessarily have the right skill set to deal with some of those kinds of analytical questions. And so, in some sense, it's a preamble to saying, well, it's all very well having this data, but how do we get the best out of it? Is to think about the skills mix, the skills availability, and the training and retraining opportunities that are available in the UK at the moment in relation to these topics. So the title of my talk is Training Needs in the Industrial Strategy, and that's really because the government has expressed a number of very strong views over the last couple of years around the skills gap that exists, particularly in relation to digital skills in the UK. And I wanted to set that alongside what's actually happened, but also what the need is in terms of our own, people in this room, our own particular need for a skills reassessment. So I want to talk a little bit about the context for this, the strategy itself and the skills requirements, a little bit about what we mean by the skills problem, because it's actually, as ever, slightly more complicated than just a skills gap. And I want to work us through what some of the possible solutions are in terms of tackling the gaps, the shortages and the mismatches. And in doing that, I want to draw on some new survey work we've done of stakeholders such as yourselves, and the needs that you've expressed in terms of areas you need to know more about, new tools and skills that you need to acquire. And then we'll finish off with a couple of issues that I think are quite fundamental, both for the role of government and for the role of firms in ensuring they're best equipped to make use of these new data sources. So that's the plan, and in around about 15 minutes from here. So let's think about this context first of all, and what we know about the changing retail labour force. I mean, just yesterday, Sainsbury's announcing axing 2,000 UK jobs and major cost-cutting drive, mainly from HR functions. Some might cheer at that basis, given that HR has been responsible for the loss of jobs elsewhere in retail for the last few years. But it's the latest example of a restructuring in employment terms of the retail sector for it to become more leaner and more efficient. And the mission statement, as far as the BRC is concerned, is about fewer jobs but better. Now, we know that retailing is the largest employer sectorally in the UK, over 3 million jobs, but numbers have been declining since 2008, and that inflection point that David talked about earlier. And we know why that is. It's because of cost pressures more generally. That probably explains why we spend less on food proportionally, because it's cheaper, so food price deflation. The national living wage, amongst other kind of interventions that have pushed up wage costs, and of course digital transformation, which has affected the nature of the business models that we're trying to work with. And there could be as many as 900,000 fewer jobs, it's suggested, by 2025. But the issue is the ones that are left are going to be higher earning and more productive. And those kinds of jobs are in this room, and they're the things that we are doing, amongst others. So many of the tasks that we're engaged with in terms of data analysis, in terms of customer insight, and sharing those insights with others in the organisation through our leadership roles is absolutely at the heart of this fewer jobs but better mantra. Now, what does the government have to say about this? Well, the government has blown hot and cold on the retail sector and on skills and training needs. Back in 2012, there was, some of you may have missed it, a retail sector strategy which identified STEM skills, science, technology, engineering and math skills, as lacking in the sector, and saying that the government would commission a skills gap analysis to suggest how it would be tackled. It also said, and the second quote actually is really what led to CDRC, that retailers collect rich data, but there are gaps in their knowledge. The government will help to identify and fill those gaps by encouraging knowledge sharing between retailers, academics and government. And that was very much the kind of public sector kind of stimulus for the funding that led to the establishment of the CDRC. And the government committed to sort of monitoring the progress on this incrementally. However, when you now go to look for the retail sector strategy published in 2012, what do you see? Well, that's what you see. Okay. This page cannot be found because a few things happened between 2012 and now, not least Brexit, referendums and so on, which has meant that retailing got de-emphasised by government until relatively recently. And certainly post the Brexit referendum, there was a sudden re-establishment of an interest in retail and some interest in the thoughts of actually establishing a retail sector deal, for example, as a sector that's seen as important in employment terms. But one of the things that did come out of the referendum was actually a realisation that we needed to invest more appropriately in our industrial strategy, and many of you will have seen the Green Paper, one of whose building blocks, one of the horizontal pillars of which was skills challenge. And again, out comes the shortage of high-skilled technicians, particularly below graduate level, and shortages in sectors that depend on STEM skills, which you would have thought would have included retailing, but the report only mentions retailing twice. And although there are prospects of retail sector deal and a skills survey announced in August, there's been lamentably slow progress in this kind of area. And the Parliamentary Select Committee that looked at this aspect of the Green Paper that came out earlier this year, particularly around skills, had a damning quote a few months ago. Given the weaknesses identified by the government in the UK's skills-based proposals contained in the Industrial Strategy White Green Paper leave much to be desired. A disappointing combination of re-announcements, continuations of existing policy and vague aspirations. So one possible conclusion from this is that actually as a commercial sector, as an educational sector, we're on our own as far as many of these issues are concerned. So it's going to be important for us to think about what actually is the underlying skills need in our particular space. And that's what I want to talk about in this next piece. What is this skills problem that we're dealing with? And I think when we're thinking about the skills problem more generally, we have to differentiate between what you could call gaps, shortages, and mismatches. So by shortages, that's basically a recruitment need. So we're ideally looking to create, if I can get my little arrow working, that'll do, yeah, a properly skilled workforce. In our case, a properly skilled workforce that can deal with digital analysis appropriately and data. We're drawing on a wider workforce, but indeed a potential workforce in trying to recruit to these roles, but actually there aren't enough people out there to perform the required jobs. That's a skills shortage. There's also the skills gap. So thinking about our existing IT or digital workforce, there's a competence shortfall amongst existing professionals, and that's a retraining need. So what are we doing as organisations to invest in our existing staff, our existing employees, to ensure that they can best equip themselves to tackle these new challenges of data sharing and analysis? And the third piece is a harder one. It's what would you call a skills mismatch. So despite all our efforts in retraining, despite all our efforts to recruit, actually there's a curriculum problem. We're not training in schools and universities and colleges, in our own, if you like, industrial academies, the right kinds of competencies to deal with the job. That's a longer haul, that's a bigger challenge, because redesigning a curriculum, bringing in a new degree program or a new qualification is an extraordinarily lengthy process in most universities and most colleges these days. And in fact, it may be the private sector has to do more work in this area. So let's think about these three kinds of considerations in relation to the job to be done in this room, in relation to data analysis. And let's think, first of all, I want to talk about skills gaps, the retraining need, if you like. So what do we say as a profession about what we need for existing employees? We did a survey of a particular location and customer analysis professionals this year from a couple of professional organisations to find out, first of all, what training had actually happened. And a third of those we surveyed had done no training at all in the past year. Been no continuing professional development at all. And though of the majority that had, much of that training was actually in generic management or business skills, were not particularly around digital or software or analytical skills. The majority that had done what we might regard as relevant training, much of it was in proprietary courses. And products like Alteryx and so on, Tableau, very much around data fusion and data sharing. So it's clear that we're getting the point that we need to do work in this particular kind of area. But it's not just about the, if you like, the tools and techniques and platforms. It's also about what we do with that insight. And so the Doug Influencing course, for example, came up as one of the most popularly mentioned programs, and our Oxford-based location analysis course. And some of the CDRC's own capacity building work, particularly around new programming tools like Python and R and so on. But we were more interested in trying to understand what the need was, where the priorities were. And so we asked individuals to comment on 3 particular areas of skills. The first of these to do with the tools themselves, mathematical, statistical, and programming tools. Where was the gap? Where did people see they had a gap in terms of retraining? And we looked at introductory level and at advanced level. And this is maybe hard to read from the back, but certainly look at introductory level. And again, it's some of the newer tools, some of the newer approaches and techniques. So Tableau, scenario planning, R, SQL, and R for spatial analysis were the top kind of 4 that came out of that, with well over a third of people saying they needed at least introductory level courses in that area. And even when you got to advanced level, people are still wrestling with advanced use of Excel, apparently, which is rather distressing. But again, Tableau, machine learning, SQL, and content analysis tools like NVivo used to analyze qualitative data rather than quantitative data. So we're really starting to think outside the usual suspects when it comes to mathematical, statistical, and programming tools. And then we asked people around areas of what we call domain-specific knowledge. In other words, not just the sort of tools and techniques, but what are the areas that directly affect your levels of knowledge where you need perhaps training or retraining or refresher course. And this is the ranking of those areas where people felt training would be useful. And it's a very broad-based list. And again, I think it reflects the increased demands being placed on customer insight and data analysis teams by the business to do an increasingly wide variety of tasks. Not just network planning, but also things like competitor analysis, not just, if you like, some of the bread and butter work in spatial analysis like catchment area definition and geodemographic segmentation, but work on, for example, workplace statistics, database planning, omni-channel retailing, demand-side data innovation, international trends. So really there is a big demand out there for a very wide range of awareness improvement in terms of domain-specific knowledge. And the third area we asked about was one which I found really the most instructive, and that was in the area of communication and visualization methods and approaches. And I talked about this last time, I think, when I was a panel member in last year's Doug Day, but thinking about the sorts of ways in which we want to communicate some of the insights that we receive. And certainly, the majority of us as with quant backgrounds or with computer science backgrounds, maths backgrounds, communication skills are at a premium, challenging individuals to be able to put across the ideas and insights they've generated through data sharing, through new sources of data, through data fusion, in effective and persuasive ways. And what comes out of this, really most interestingly, there's introductory level insights, visual art design. I think we talked about data art last time. We spoke about skills gaps. But increasingly important to put across what are really quite complex and wicked data insights using perhaps some of the design and creative skills of the artist. Storytelling skills. Again, a good third saying we'd really like to understand, even at introductory level, storytelling. And that's something which I know that Doug has been offering in terms of training. And even at advanced level, simply presentation skills, not just how to use software like Prezi or PowerPoint, but actually how to present persuasively and effectively to a board-level audience or to decision makers more generally. So there's clearly some really strong sets of retraining needs to address some of the skills gaps. When we take a step back and think about some of the other aspects of skills, in particular skills shortages, what strikes me certainly is still the significant number of vacancies. Now, we can't measure in the same kind of narrow way the vacancies and supply that exist within this room, if you like, in terms of data analysis. We can take a step back and think about digital vacancies and digital demand. At the moment, we're looking like there is something in the order of 107,000 in 2015 vacancies for digital jobs in the UK. Now, most of those are around areas like project management and agile development, but look at that 12,800 that are around analytical skills. Look at the 9,400 around business intelligence and the 8,000 around e-commerce. All of those kinds of digital openings overlap with our own skill set and interest. And that's 100,000 permanent roles. There's about another 55,000 contract roles typically available. And look at that year to year. That's not really going down very significantly over time as the demand ramps up for these new kinds of skills. So real skills shortages. Despite that, I mean, the UK is punching ahead of its weight. So in terms of millennials with STEM degrees, for example, we're well ahead of other European countries. France, Austria are the next nearest in the scheme of things. But it's clear that there is a gap between the training of millennials with these degrees and their ability to be recruited into these roles. And part of that's about the lack of relevant experience. So the barriers on the right here, lack of relevant experience and difficulty finding the right people are the biggest kinds of obstacles to recruiting good digital data scientists. And one of the things that we heard about just before the coffee break in terms of Guy's MSc dissertation scheme, for example, is a really good way for individuals being able to get some of that kind of work experience, which gives us some confidence that they will be good as future employees in these sorts of roles. So the apprenticeship levy, the MSc dissertation scheme, the approved researcher schemes, the ONS Data Science Academy and so on, are all ways of trying to bridge the gap between the STEM qualification at school or at university and the workplace potential of those sorts of individuals. But ultimately, there is a skills mismatch. And the challenge is to the education sector, because there is a consistent gap between demand and supply, which in 2015, which is the last data we have, was running at around about 53,000 net deficit in terms of digital skilled posts. And of course, this is not going to change because, as the quote suggests from OECD, specialist skills are going to be changing rapidly with changes in technology. And the formal education system simply isn't up to that degree of agile responsiveness to the changing needs of the commercial sector in relation to their own particular requirements. And that's going to need, I think, much harder work by businesses themselves, working with universities, working with government agencies like ONS, and multi-stakeholder partnership. It's going to be really important to deliver the kinds of skills that we need to meet commercial needs over the next few years. The final piece I want to talk about in the last 5 minutes is really the issues that come out of that insight for people in this room. And I want to identify really three. First of these is around hiring practices. We all know in this room, because I'm sure we've been headhunted by various unscrupulous competitors and headhunting companies, that actually the knee-jerk response to the skills shortage and skills gap issue is actually firms engaging in opportunistic hiring rather than recruiting and retraining for the task in many cases. And that's fine for the individuals concerned because it leads to higher salaries and some interesting job opportunities. But actually, is it good for the sector? Is it good for frankly, the long-term benefit of this particular area of skill? Because it leads to inflation of salaries and employment costs. It means that you have this kind of differential that emerges in financial terms between the new hires. And how many businesses have I seen recently where there's a great deal of resentment by the existing staff of this new, very fashionable set of hires that have been brought in to tackle data science. Well, we could do that if you only let us do the job. You've kind of redefined the job in this kind of a way, and the salaries are much higher for those sorts of individuals. And so you end up with these terrible kind of turf wars between the new hires and the existing staff if you're not careful. And there's a risk more broadly of developing a culture in which there's a sort of headhunting and defection approach as a matter of course. And that can't be healthy for corporate cultures more generally. So this is a plea, if you like, for thinking about how we get out of this spiral towards opportunistic hiring that is a direct consequence of the way in which skill shortages are being dealt with by firms. And the other issue, of course, is the rapidly evolving skill set challenge. So this lack of alignment between supply and demand is not just down to, if you like, the simple lack of bodies. It's also the right kinds of bodies doing the right kinds of things. And the rapidly evolving skill set in our space in particular, as we set ourselves new challenges, as firms become more aspirational and ambitious in the way they'll use data. And if we think about, again, how firms start to use or specify for these new skill sets, the Dilbert cartoon says, you know, there's a huge disconnect between my enormous technical knowledge and the trivial tasks you assign to me. That's a temporary situation, ASOC. Okay, good. Eventually your technical skills will become outdated. You know. So it's saying that actually that we've got to evolve these skill sets in real time. And that means, unfortunately, that we have to spend much more time on appropriate job specifications, revisiting those over time, addressing mismatches in salary levels, dealing with inadequate training and development in firms, and thinking about the retraining for existing staff rather than just as a knee-jerk reaction buying in a new team of data analysts, and avoid the development of this us and them culture. And I say that this is not an issue for government. It's clear that government has other preoccupations on its hands. Someone said to me the other day, one of the advantages of Brexit is that government won't have time for anything else, and so it won't interfere with anything we want to do. But actually what that does mean in practice is that the kinds of things that could be useful government intervention around new technical education proposals that came as part of the growth strategy, for example, and the apprenticeship levy, are actually, in many cases, poorly thought through and have some really difficult implementation challenges. And the attention of government isn't on them in the same way it would be without a kind of Brexit scenario. And therefore, we as firms also have to take responsibility, and we as universities, representing my own interests in this. So it's really critical, I think, that employers must articulate needs and start to work with others to create the kinds of training, the kinds of capacity building that allow us in this room to deal with the new sources of data, the data sharing needs that we increasingly face. Retailing is actually quite good at this, I have to say, generally. I was looking at some data published just last week that said that retailing is spending about £1,200 per employee per year on training compared to £800 of financial services. So retailing is doing a little bit better, but I don't know how much of that £1,275 is actually spent on training in relation to data science professionals, for example, within retail organisations. Firms, again, need to avoid overly opportunistic hiring strategies and need to invest in training. So one of the things that CDRC is doing in terms of its training agenda and capacity building agenda is to try and provide some of those sorts of training and reskilling opportunities, particularly in relation to some of the platforms and the tools, but also in putting on some of the, if you like, the domain-specific awareness improvement areas across a range of issues, and in thinking about some of the leadership agendas. And Doug is also doing much of this kind of work through its series of workshops and teaching activity. So it's really important, I think, that as, if you like, representative associations and as funded activities, we're able to supplement the training that's required to allow us to deliver the insights from data sharing and from new sources. So that's what I have to say. I think I'm going to pass on, I think, in a second to Paul and to Alex to talk more substantively about the particular kinds of data and outputs that the CDRC is making available. But thank you for your time. Thanks a lot.